You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from theheart.org on Medscape.
Hi, everyone. This is John Mandrola from theheart.org Medscape Cardiology, and this is This Week in Cardiology for November 30th, 2018. This week, the approach to patients with aortic stenosis and high surgical risk, conflict of interest, spin in the cardiovascular literature, and the low-carb diet debates. The first topic this week is that authors of the U.S. core valve trial published in JACC 5-year outcomes of the TAVR versus SAVR in patients with severe aortic stenosis and high surgical risk. This trial studied the self-expanding Medtronic valve versus a surgical valve, and it was almost 800 patients, older patients, mean age 83. The all-cause mortality rates at 5 years were 55.3% for TAVR and 55.4% for SAVR. Subgroup analyses showed no differences in mortality in any of the groups. Major stroke rates were 12.3% for TAVR and 13.2% for SAVR. So pretty good equal results. Measures of structural valve deterioration look similar in both groups. Now, these long-term results now add to the previously published Partner 1 data, which studied almost 700 patients and reported death rates at 5 years of 68% for TAVR and 62% for SAVR, which did not meet statistical significance. So the equivalence of outcomes at 5 years with both valve types is reassuring. Favorable measures of structural valve integrity at 5 years is also totally adequate for the average 83-year-old. But I think the looming question with TAVR is longevity of the valve when used in younger patients with lower surgical risk who will live longer. Of course, the other major question when approaching patients with severe aortic stenosis and high surgical risk is the decision to operate on that patient in the first place. Many of these patients are very close to the natural end of life, and aligning care with their goals is crucial. And I'll take this opportunity to remind everybody that not doing a life-prolonging procedure should never be equated with doing nothing. Offering palliative care counts as care, it's just with a different set of goals. The next couple of topics, I'm going to talk about conflict of interest. So let's start with conflicts of interest in terms of professional health groups. So a Canadian group of researchers published a meta-analysis and systematic review in the BMJ, and they wanted to assess the effect of different food sources of fructose-containing sugars on glycemic control. The effect of fructose-containing sugars on glycemic control depends on the total energy content of the food and the food source. When fructose comes from fruit and does not add to excess calories, they found no ill effects on glycemic indices. But when fructose came from sugar-sweetened beverages and it added to the total energy content, which is easy because these beverages are often high in calories, the researchers found significant increases in fasting blood glucose and insulin levels. Now, this is an impressive paper, this systematic review in the BMJ, but it's hardly news that consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages have no health value, and if consumed in large doses, add to the burden of obesity and diabetes and heart disease. And here is the problem. This study was published just days before a leading UK diabetes charity faced a storm of criticism for signing a lucrative multi-year partnership with a major soft drink company. Now, almost every day in clinic, I hear people say they have trouble losing weight because they can't burn off their calories. This is a false belief, and I blame the makers of sugar-sweetened beverages like Coke, Pepsi, Frito-Lay, other junk food companies. These companies have marketed the notion that consuming their products is fine as long as you burn off the calories. I'm no obesity expert, but I'm fairly confident in saying that people cannot outrun a diet high in calories from junk food. So no, I don't think it's moral, right, for professional societies or charities whose mission it is to promote health should take dollars from companies whose business model it is to sell as much unhealthy products as possible. I can't see any confluence of interest in these types of relationships, only conflicts of interest. The mission of a diabetes association is to do everything possible to stop people from drinking sugar-sweetened beverages And how can they do that if they take big money from the companies that make them? Now, I feel this way even as a huge fan of liberty and free markets. Health, however, is different, especially now that all signals point to a looming crisis in public health due to obesity-related diabetes. Now, there's another conflict of interest topic that I wanted to bring up, and this gets to do with how electrophysiologists choose cardiac devices. Patrice Wendling is one of our top journalists, and she is a super professional. In the press room at the AHA, she alerted me to two beautiful abstracts on how our brains can be tricked. Now, the first came from a group of researchers from Yale. They asked the provocative question, does money influence the decision to choose a certain make of a cardiac device? Now, as background, before I even tell you about this, most doctors I know will bristle at the suggestion they can be influenced by marketing. Not me. I choose the best device for my patient. Well, to test our susceptibility to be influenced, the researchers took data from the Open Payments Program in the United States, which requires companies to disclose dollars paid to doctors, and combined it with the NCDR-ICD registry. And they found that doctors who received the highest payments from a particular company were more likely to implant devices from that company. And these results showed and were consistent across all four different device companies. If a doctor took most of her money from company A, then she used more of company A's device. If another doc took more from company B, she used more of B, and so on. The research team also found a dose-response relationship. In other words, the more money one took, the higher the odds ratio for using that company's device. Now, I mention this data for multiple reasons. One is to make us humble. Of course, we are susceptible to being influenced. And remarkably, the median money paid to each doc in the Open Payments Program is quite modest, yet it still makes a difference in choice. Now, one criticism I heard of this study online was that doctors who believe in one company's device may be both more apt to use that device and more apt to take money from that company. While I don't have a counterfactual to disprove that, I don't buy it. Do you? Really? The next topic also concerns tricking our brains, and this has to do with spin in the cardiovascular literature. Now, another way the brain of a doctor can be tricked is with manipulation of language to detract from neutral finding of an experiment. This is called spin, and it's previously been defined in numerous studies outside the CV literature. Examples of spin include when authors may emphasize significant results in secondary endpoints or subgroups, or they may claim the treatment is beneficial without acknowledging that the trial was neutral. Dr. Shahzeb Khan and coworkers from the John Stroger Hospital in Cook County, Chicago, set out to systematically study spin in the CV literature. They presented their data at AHA. Khan and his team searched for studies with neutral top-line results from 6 major cardiovascular journals between the years 2015 and 17. They identified 93 such randomized trials and found spin in, sit down for this, 57% of the full text and 66% of the abstracts. They learned that each part of the paper could contain spin. They saw it in the results section in a little over a third of the papers, in the conclusion sections in about half. Almost a third of papers had spin in all sections of the abstracts. Now, while spin is wildly common at medical meetings, at the podium, you hear it all the time, I would have guessed the rate of spin in peer-reviewed papers would have been lower. You would think journal editors and peer reviewers would cause authors to tamp down this sort of manipulative language. So this is a sobering and noteworthy finding because translation of evidence from the literature requires a clear-eyed view of the results. Even when primary results of a trial are statistically significant, there are still many reasons to remain doubtful. For instance, small effect sizes, lousy comparators, biased designs, run-in periods, and highly selected patients. All these things should make us skeptical of positive results. But when a study is neutral, be on the lookout for spin and manipulative language. The bottom line is that medical progress is slow and hard. It's one of the reasons why I am a medical conservative. The final topic today gets into the low-carb diet controversy. The words robust and nutrition studies are not often used together in the same sentence. Recently, however, there was a strong, robust study looking at the question of how well low-carbohydrate diet increases the energy burn in the maintenance phase of weight control. The recent paper was presented at Obesity Week meeting and it was published in the BMJ. This research centers on the carbohydrate insulin model of obesity, in which high insulin levels after a high-carb meal promotes fat storage, which in turn increases hunger, food cravings, and lowers energy burn, and hence promotes weight gain. Drs. Ludwig and Ebeling's experiment required patients to have lost 10% of their body weight in 10 weeks before entering the study. Then they randomized these patients or individuals into 3 groups, high carb, moderate carb, and low carb for 20 weeks, and the researchers fed the individuals each of their meals. Total energy expenditure was measured by a doubly labeled water, and it was higher in the low carb group, approximately 200 kilocalories per day greater when comparing high to low carbohydrate groups. This is a significant difference, and it was not due to physical activity. So on the surface, this seems like a big finding for the maintenance of weight loss. But science is hard, and Kevin Hall and Yuan Gu, writing in an editorial in the BMJ, questioned the methodology of the study. Since the outcome of the experiment was a change in energy rates, their criticism centers on which baseline to use. They say the authors did not follow their pre-registered statistical plan and modified the comparison of energy expenditures to compare to immediately post-weight loss period rather than the pre-weight loss energy expenditure. So when Hall analyzed the data according to the original plan, they found that low-carb diets did not significantly increase energy expenditures. Now, they give explanations as to why their reanalysis was the best way to analyze the data, not least because that 7 of the 8 versions of the pre-registered protocol called for this method. But Ludwig and Ebeling responded to the reanalysis of this in the BMJ, and the BMJ is publishing all of these responses in their rapid communication. So Ludwig and Ebeling defended the change in protocol and said it was completely transparent, and they stated that it went through a highly rigorous review. They had 6 experts and more than 100 points of criticism and discussion. They also reiterated that they made the full database publicly available immediately upon publication. Perhaps the first time for a nutrition study of this magnitude, they said. So my comments on this, 4 comments. First, on the matter of science transparency, we should give huge kudos to Ludwig and his group for sharing the data set immediately after publication. This allowed a reanalysis and a fantastic discussion. Note that this doesn't happen often in cardiovascular research, but it should. Imagine if we could reanalyze the COAPT and MITRA-FR studies or the REDUCE-IT trial of the fish oil that was recently presented at AHA. Second, I recently wrote about Professor Brian Nosick's paper on how the way data is analyzed can have a great influence on effect sizes. This debate is a great example of how researchers' degrees of freedom can make big differences in effect sizes. Now, I'm not a PhD, but if the choice of pre-weight loss energy expenditure versus post-weight loss energy expenditure as a comparator makes that much different, it suggests to me that these results are somewhat fragile. Now, third, it should be no surprise that finding the best components of diet are hard or maybe impossible. Consider the external validity of this really cool experiment, namely that I have trouble believing it could be replicated in situations where researchers are not controlling every calorie of intake. If you give people freedom in the real world, I think it would be very difficult to reproduce these findings. And finally, the vast majority of patients I see eat far too many processed carbohydrates. So as a clinician in the obesity belt of the United States, I spend most of my time getting people to just stop eating cake, ice cream, and potato chips. And yes, I focus on reducing carbohydrate intake. So that's it for this week in cardiology. I'm grateful that you listened. Remember that if you like this podcast, please consider subscribing, giving us a 5-star review so that other people can find it. Until next week, this is John Mandrola from the heart.org Medscape Cardiology.
You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from theheart.org on Medscape.